Can you hear me
Hello,
now?
everybody. Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, Brent. I was trying to get your... it's just gone 6:30. I'm Catherine Croft. I'm the director of 20th Century Society, and we're here tonight to listen to Brent Smith. I just wanted to say briefly before we embark on his talk that 20th Century Society is a building preservation organisation for buildings from 1914 onwards, and we're a membership organisation. You can join, but our primary role is campaigning to keep the best buildings from our period. And to that end, we normally run physical events which we use as a fundraiser. So although tonight's event is free to come along as a Zoom member, if you were able to give us a donation towards our casework, we would be really pleased. And we are going to send everyone who donates £10 or more a set of the 4 Corbusier postcards, images of India, that John East showed us in his talk a couple of weeks ago about the most recent trip the 20th Century Society has done to India. Brent is a retired building surveyor. He comes on lots and lots of our events, is always incredibly knowledgeable, and also extremely good at finding the best bars in every town I've been to with him. And he should have been leading a trip for us to Chicago this month, but unfortunately that's obviously have to be postponed. We will be running that again as soon as we possibly can. And he came with us to India last November, but he wasn't his first trip to India by a long way, and he had the immense privilege of going with Roderick Gradidge, an architectural historian who I'm sure he will tell us all about, who I remember working with when I first worked at the Victorian Society. He was an incredibly flamboyant and interesting character, and he led a previous trip to look specifically not just at the work of Lutyens himself in India, but at all the buildings that Lutyens went to look at, and was probably, knowing Lutyens, incredibly rude about whilst he was working on his own design proposals. So I think without more ado, we should hand over to Brent. Brent is, I should say, in Hitchin, where the Wi-Fi is not brilliant. So he is going to try and do something very clever with the images so that they upload while he's talking about the previous one. Hopefully, if it all goes well, you will have absolutely no idea that this is happening, but we may have problems. We're hoping, we're going to be positive. We're going to hope it's all going to go utterly smoothly. First image.
Oh no, I need the screen first.
Yeah, you're there. You just need to do your share screen, Brent, and you'll be...
Yes. Right, well, good evening. Not only was it...
Sorry, yeah, perfect. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Am I on?
Yeah. You are on. I was still seeing the view with all the little slides up the side, but I think that was the time lag that we were talking about.
Oh, right.
It now looks perfect. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I was going to say, not only was it going to be this month that we were going to be in Chicago, it was actually today. And I've worked out that we would have been in the Johnson's Wax building in Racine at the moment. I've seen a great number of Franklin Wright's buildings, and that's of the ones I haven't seen, that's the one I most wanted to see. But hopefully that will be coming again. And just explaining this time lag thing, unfortunately it's something like 8 or 10 seconds I've got between the slides. If I get terribly out of sync, I'm going to be told. But anyway, if I start off, 22 years ago I went to India with the late Roderick Gradidge and the Lutyens Trust, The idea was to look at New Delhi and to travel around India to see the places that Lutyens visited before completing his proposals. As you'll see later, this culminated in us having high tea with the Indian president and Roddy giving a lecture on the importance of retaining the Lutyens bungalow zone. It may have gone by now, but that was part of the portrait in the Art Workers Guild of Lutyens. This image is Carl Laubin's wonderful composition of all of Lutyens' projects. Prints of it are available from the Lutyens Trust, and the original is in the collection of Sir Terry Farrell. Carl, obviously, Carl in fact is a friend of mine and has given me permission to use the image. I normally include details of Lutyens' life and work, particularly the buildings that we have in North Hertfordshire, but I won't be doing that tonight for reasons of time. I'll come back to this painting and Lutyens after showing you all the buildings that we visited in India, but I will share this quotation. Never since the days of Sheridan and Goldsmith has a man of genius been so widely beloved. Lutyens possessed the faculty of making everyone feel much younger. He adopted an identical attitude of bubbling friendliness whenever he was talking to a queen, dowager or cigarette girl, a cardinal or a schoolboy. I thought that was rather good. Now for an image of Roddy. It's actually 22 years since I went round India with him, and we looked at New Delhi, the buildings which Lutyens and Baker had done there, and I'll refer to him as Roddy. That's how he preferred to be known, and if I keep saying Roderick, it will sound like Michael Palin in The Life of Brian. His father had been in the Corps of Guides, stationed in the northwest frontier of India, and although he was born in Norfolk, his childhood was spent in India until he went to Stowe School in 1943. Lutyens' reputation had fallen and has risen again. Gavin Stamp wrote an article in the Architectural Review in November 1981 entitled "The Rise and Fall and Rise of Edwin Lutyens." The variations in Lutyens' critical standing provides an interesting sidelight to the history of the fluctuating fortunes of the modern movement in Britain. Roddy was an expert on the work of Lutyens. Alan Powers wrote that it was Roddy who led the rehabilitation of Lutyens' reputation, which after his death had been dismissed as just a stylist. This is a quotation from Sir Basil Spence. I'll stick my neck out now and make a prediction. I think that Lutyens will come back into favour in the future. He has been under a cloud since his death, but I think there will be a gradual coming back to the appreciation of this very great man. There was a I think I've gone out. I think I've.
Yeah, you're on. Yeah, that's right. Now we're seeing the Jonathan Glancy quote, Brent.
Okay, right, good. This is a quotation in the Architectural Review. He was saying that what we now had was post-war prefabricated Hertfordshire schools good, Lutyens bad. Even Le Corbusier was questionable. From the mid-1940s, he'd moved into expressionist territory, teetering on the immoral. But there was a wonderful exhibition in 1982, curated by Piers Goff at the Hayward Gallery, which was such a wonderful combination of building styles. And the culmination of that exhibition was the great room with these models of Liverpool Cathedral and the Viceroy's house. So going back to Roddy, Roddy made it clear that he didn't like Lutyens' initial attitude towards the Indian people and their architecture. You will see from my slides that Lutyens overcame his prejudices and produced some sublime buildings. Roddy had a great affinity to India. His father had served in the army there, and he had many uncles and aunts who still lived there or had lived there. He told me that the resident Brits in India were appalled by the language of British visitors, and he was disappointed that this was now being taken as being how everybody had felt at the time. He felt that William Dalrymple, in particular, had been influenced by these letters and reports and had led him to write about his love of Italy in a way that that certainly Roddy didn't like. So we got there in the monsoon. The monsoon was running late, which was a great annoyance to Roddy, and the roads were flooded. Children were diving off the high pavements into the road and swimming. And the other great story of the time was about the price of onions, which was quite amusing. The first of the Mughal buildings which we went to see was the Friday Mosque, which is the largest mosque in India, and thousands of people pray there every Friday. This is a rather nice watercolour of it, painted in 1797. And this slide, if I've caught up with it yet, it shows the Friday congregation, but also, rather interestingly, the lack of traffic that there used to be around it. There are red forts in both Delhi and Agra. The one in Delhi is the larger, but the one in Agra is in a rather better state of repair. This is a watercolour of the Red Fort painted around 1850. And this is the Hall of Private Audience in the centre of the Red Fort, constructed of white marble inlaid with precious stones. It used to have a silver ceiling, but it's been restored in wood. This is St James's Church. This is particularly dear to Roddy. It's also known as Skinner's Church, and it's one of the oldest cities in the city, the oldest churches in the city. And we had lunch at Maiden's Hotel. The original hotel was run by the Maiden brothers from 1894 onwards, and it moved to this location in 1902. It was considered to be the best hotel in Delhi. I don't know what that is. It was altered and extended in the late 1930s. Obviously after Lutyens was there, but as with most of the buildings that we saw, Roddy didn't like it. This is the Mutiny Memorial. It was erected by the Public Works Department in 1863 and designed to be just higher than the adjoining stucco pillar. And I found it a really interesting thing particularly, it gave me an insight, I think, into the Indian mentality, in that it had been restored, and on the 25th anniversary of independence, they put this plaque on it, and I don't know if you can read it, but it basically says that the enemy of the inscriptions on this monument were those who rose against colonial rule and fought bravely for national liberation in 1857. And I can think of very few nations where somebody would do that rather than remove the inscriptions altogether. This is St. Stephen's College. It was obviously wasn't there when Lutyens was there. The original college was in the Indo-Saracenic style which Lutyens absolutely hated. And this is the replacement of it by Walter Sykes George. And it appears to have been strongly influenced by Lutyens. The Delhi Durbar of 1911 was held to crown George V as Emperor of India. And on that site, they now have a thing called a Coronation Memorial Park. And we had with us Professor Rana from the School of Architecture. I seem to recall he hadn't had any salary for about 18 months. I don't know how he managed to survive. But with the blessing of Mrs. Gandhi, he'd had these plinths, with the blessing of Mrs. Gandhi, he'd had a set of plinths set up in this park, and moved to it statues which had been taken from the centre of New Delhi. The empty ones are ones where the Canadian government repatriated them because they were ones of men who'd been governors of both Canada and India. But this is the really magnificent statue of King Emperor George V, and it stood in the Chhatri, which you'll see later, and it's one of the finest statues I think I've ever seen. An obelisk was erected there to commemorate the Delhi Durbar, and designed by Lutyens, and a memorial plaque put up. We were there obviously to also look at the buildings of Lutyens and Baker, as well as the buildings that they'd looked at before they designed them. And we had a wonderful morning at the Viceroy's house and the gardens, and I'll show slides of that later. But we've been invited to take high tea with the President of India, and we thought that that would be cancelled because there was fighting in the state of Bihar, and there were people coming and going all the time when we were there in the morning, and a sort of grandstand had been erected for journalists, and there must have been hundreds of them, outside TV broadcasting and all sorts. And we assumed that he would cancel our high tea, but he didn't, and it was absolutely wonderful. He entertained us for about 20 minutes, half an hour or so. He was very keen to know from Roddy what he thought of the state of the buildings, and Roddy actually did a report for him on them. Concern about the bungalow area, which I'll refer to later. And the most wonderful thing was that the next day, and sorry, and the next day on at our hotel, this chap came round on a motorcycle with packs of photographs for each of us, courtesy of the president. And I thought, I just thought it was absolutely wonderful. Anyway, on now to more of the buildings that Lutyens was looking at. This is Humayun's tomb, which we went to and spent some time at when we were there last year. It was rather clearer when I was there with Roddy, and but it's probably the finest example of early Mughal architecture in India. And obviously, those of you who watched this artist thing a couple of weeks ago, you'll have seen lots of John East's slides, so I won't show you very many of mine. But a wonderful building, and they've now restored some of the gardens, and it's extremely, it's extremely pleasant there. And if it's come up yet, this is a photograph of it taken in 1860. Facing it, but which we didn't go to when we were there last year, is Sadhvar Young's tomb, which was built as a sort of bit of a replica of the other one, but about 100 years later. The Qutb Minar of 1805 is again an amazing structure, 73 meters high. This great towering, tapering tower. It's 5 stories, and there's another one which was started, which would have been a scaled up version about 4 times the size, but that was subsequently abandoned. But you can see the base of it, which is very impressive. Now, coming on to some of Lutyens' thoughts on Indian architecture. Personally, I do not believe there's any real Indian architecture of any great tradition. They are just spurts, various mushroom dynasties with as much intellect in them as any other Art Nouveau. And then it is essentially the building style of children. At the fort in Delhi, the most admired of Indian examples, perhaps after the Taj, behind the white throne, a throne wherein or on a man can only squat cross-legged, is a lovely black wall painted with arabesques of birds and beasts in colour. He was very damning of the of that. This is the Iron Pillar of Delhi. It's thought to be at least 1,000 years old, I think, and it's never rusted. It has a high proportion of I can't remember if it's phosphorus or manganese in it, and it never needs any cleaning. Next, we went to St Martin's Church, which again we visited last year, and Roddy wrote of that, something of the stability of Lutyens' lost masterpiece, i.e. Liverpool Cathedral, can be caught in the cross-vaulting of St Martin's and the brilliant way in which the window detailing is handled. This is now a design drawing of it, and later also by Smith. We went to Lady Hardinge's Sarai. She was the wife of the Viceroy. This was unfortunately in ruinous condition when we were there. I don't know what it's like now because we didn't see it on this last visit, but it was a magnificent building. I had to actually climb through a fence to go and look around it, and it was completely boarded up. We had an absolutely wonderful few hours in the National Archives of India, a building which had been designed by Lutyens, and we were shown a lot of the original drawings of New Delhi. Another of his actual buildings there, a building that followed Lutyens was the National Gallery of Modern Art, which we went to. And one evening, because we were rather celebrity guests, I guess, in Delhi while we were there, we got invited to an evening with this lady, who's Mrs. Sunita Kohli. She's an interior designer with connections to Mrs. Gandhi, and she was a member of the Lutyens Trust. And she put on a really lavish do for us to show us off to the great and good of Delhi. But my great memories of it, other than how totally gross our house was, dripping in gold, silver, silk and everything that you could think of, was seeing rows of poor people sleeping on the street outside our house and being buttonholed by the chairman of the Archaeological Survey of India, who told me that he was a direct descendant of Alexander the Great and that his women, i.e. his wife and daughters, were whiter than my women, i.e. the women in my party. A couple of things by Lutyens in the centre of Delhi, the All India Arch and the memorial canopy, and this is where the great statue of George V was before it was moved to the gardens. I've put in a couple of other of Lutyens' buildings in Delhi. This is Hyderabad House, which he did for the Nizam of Hyderabad. And this is his Northern Railways house. I thought it was quite a fine building. We didn't go to Shimla, although Lutyens did, but he hadn't really gone there to look at the buildings. He just had his meetings with the Viceroy there. But it did give rise to one of his famous quotes about the Indo-Saracenic architecture, which he so disliked. If one was told that monkeys had built it all, one would have said, "What wonderful monkeys! They must be shot in case they do it again." We weren't able to go to Bodh Gaya, which is in Bihar, but I have been there since. I went, in fact, on a boat down the Ganges from Varanasi to Kolkata, and so I've taken these pictures later. Bodh Gaya is where Lord Buddha received his enlightenment, and there is what they claim is the original Bodhi tree. I think it's at least the fourth version of it, because I think that I've been to one of the Buddhist temples in Sri Lanka, and they say there that they had passed back one of the branches from their tree to re-establish the original one at Bodh Gaya. We went to Varanasi, which Roddy would still refer to as Benares, the city as old as time. It was on the banks of the Ganges, and this is again Lutyens' quote: "Oh my, the dirt, filth, and impossibility of bull, cow, and monkey worship, and oh, the stench and the hideousness of everything. Barbarism in terms of evil-smelling slime. A juggernaut car to squash the whole thing seemed logical and desirable. I had a kindly feeling to the mild Hindu, but Benares, his holy city, is filth and rotten filth beyond belief." Very strong words. We had quite an interesting time there, because we had a dawn trip planned in a boat to look at the bathing ghats, and we had to leave in pitch darkness, and Roddy lost two of the party who were really annoyed, and the boat we went on was unbelievably ramshackle, and I have great memories of it, which and some of the things floating down the Ganges at the time, a couple of cows, and sadly one dead young chap. I found the city to be wonderful and lively. I've been back there a couple of times. My wife and my friends absolutely hate it. They think it's one of the most appalling places on earth, but I really like it. At night you get the fires in the burning guts. You get the smell of the burning sandalwood. The poor people, unfortunately, have to be dealt with in electric ovens, but I just think it's one of the most amazing places that I've ever been to. And you get sights like sadhus wandering around and cows in shops, and it just I just found it one of the most amazing things I've ever been to. We were supposed to go across the Ganges in the same boat as we'd done the morning trip, but there was a revolt. In fact, I was the only one who was prepared to go over in it. So in the end, we went on a round trip by bus. And a couple of days later, reading the Hindu Times, we read that a ramshackle boat crossing the Ganges to this palace had sunk, and that 19 people had drowned. So the others on the party thought that was vindication for not going in, which I suppose was right. This is a wonderful palace, which I think Lutyens had stayed there in 1913. Now on to Sarnath. That's just about, I think it's about 20 kilometres away from Varanasi. This is where Lord Buddha passed on his enlightenment to his 4 disciples. And Buddhism isn't really, doesn't even figure as one of India's religions these days. but you still get lots of people from other countries going there, and the wheel and the three-headed lion do form part of obviously the Indian flag. They have the three-headed lion still there, and it would have been on a pillar. That this particular one is in Islamabad. Again, there's another Bodhi tree there. I'll use the term Bodhi tree, although it has different, it has 4 or 5 different names. So now on to Agra, and possibly one of the most famous buildings in the world, and in my view, certainly one of the most beautiful, the Taj Mahal. I've managed to get to Agra twice, staying there, but I've actually visited the Taj 6 times, twice at dawn, twice in the full sun, once in late afternoon, and once at sunset, plus another sunset looking at it from the Red Fort. I think it's not a building of a sort of style that I would normally like, but to me, it just is perfection. And if you see it at dawn, as the sun comes up, and you get the early rays of the sun catching all the gemstones which are cut into it, the whole thing is just absolutely wonderful. It was when the British captured Agra in 1803, sorry, Lieutenant Colonel Kidd wrote that this splendid monument, for which magnificence and taste and costliness of materials far exceeds anything of the same kind in probably the universe, the repairing and keeping in order of which will reflect such credit on the British government through every part of Hindustan. And later, Lord did restore it. That was before he was appointed Viceroy of India. Lutyens didn't like it. His view on it was architecture. This is practically nil. Veneered joinery in stone, concrete and marble on a gigantic scale. There is lots of, but no real architecture and nothing built to last. When in ruins, the building, especially the Mogul, are bad and have none of the dignity a ruin can have that has been the work of any great period. The Taj by moonlight becomes so bald and indefinite, the patterns disappear and the arch forms merge into a fog of white reflection, leaving the great turnip of a dome as a bubble poised in space. It is wonderful, but it is not architecture, and its beauty begins where architecture ceases to be. And so it is with all these Indian builders. Anything really admirable has been done by an Italian or a Chinaman. The buildings are tents in stone and little more. Baker thought rather more of it, and he wrote later, "There comes back to me the memory of the Taj Mahal. It was always beautiful, except under the fierce vertical sun and the cold full moon." These are now just a couple of pictures of Shah Jahan. This is a section through the building drawn in about 1820. And this is And next is a drawing of the interior of its dome. And this, if it's caught up, is a watercolor of the entrance to Taj, which is a wonderful building in its own right. The Taj, believe it or not, I wrote this 2 years ago because I did a talk to be the 20th anniversary of the trip, which I've just obviously updated for tonight. But believe it or not, the Taj is under some degree of threat. There's a debate in India with regard to its importance as a national monument, and BJP party spokesperson said, as a party, we do not have a view on any individual monuments, but broadly speaking, the period of Islamic rule, around 800 years, was a period of extreme exploitation, insane barbarism, and unprecedented intolerance of other faith. If anyone tries to gloss over these facts, it will be actually distorting history. It is well documented by historians of world stature that Muslim invasion and its rule represented the most oppressive and regressive world over. The next is a slide from the other side of the river, and one of my favourite slides is showing the light playing on the relief sculpture and the inlaid work around it. This is the Accra Mausoleum in Agra. This is its gateway to some, including some of our party. They think it to be a finer building than the Taj. I don't, but I do find it to be very beautiful. And behind it sits the actual mausoleum, and there's a huge paved courtyard between. And next I have a watercolour from 1795. Another building at Agra, this of 1622, sometimes referred to as the baby Taj, was a forerunner of many other buildings in India, including the Taj. And it was the first building to really move away from the use of red sandstone and the use of white marble. Now, this is the Red Fort at Agra. Shah Jahan lived out his last days there after being overthrown by one of his sons. His balcony has a superb view of his Taj Mahal, and just one of the buildings as part of the palace. And this next slide shows some of the beautiful work and detailing within the building. We then went to Fatehpur Sikri, which was an abandoned city built by Shah Jahan's father to be the capital of his empire, but for some reason it didn't work. There's been various theories, the main one being that it didn't have enough water supply, but he moved his he then moved his palace back to Agra. The slide showed the very imposing gateway, and then the other view of the inside view of the gateway, which in India they refer to as its backside. It was, the city was constructed on two rocky outcrops, and it has a huge artificial lake on one side. You'll see some of the detailing from these buildings in Lutyens' design of the Viceroy's house. The British restored Palace Sikri first in 1876 and then by Lord Curzon in 1905. And it just is a magical, absolutely magical building. We then caught, okay?
Yep.
We then caught the Chattabadi Express at this station, which is said to be the largest NCR National Rail station in India. And we went on a train, but not as old as the one I've just put up a slide of. And we had several stops. Oh, whoops. Sorry. I'll just catch up. Have I now got the picture of a palace?
You have, yes. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Right, well, this is Nadia Govind Nadia. It's a fortress palace and was said by Penelope Betjeman to be Lutyens' favourite Indian building. It was truly amazing going around it. It's got, you know, all the balconies and the bridges within the main building, and it is a very, very spectacular building. It was obviously not in the best of, quite the best of order while we were there, but it was, I could see why he would have liked it. We then went on to Orcha, which is a town in Madhya Pradesh, which was founded in 1501, and it's the capital of was the capital of the Bandela rulers. And again, it is just full of the most amazing, wonderful buildings, palaces. This one, which is the Taj Mahal, is now a luxury hotel. There's the pilgrim site of Ram Raja Mandir, which gets visited by thousands of people. Its daily numbers are between 1,500 and 3,000, but on festival days there's just an immense number of people, tens and tens of thousands. And perhaps my favourite of the buildings there were these chatteries, a row of 14 cenotaphs along the river, which was just so spectacular and so beautiful. I just really, I was just really taken by it. Our next stop was Bhopal, and before talking about the buildings in Bhopal, I must obviously talk about the Union Carbide disaster of 1984. At least 4,000 people died, but possibly as much as 16,000, and nearly 600,000 people were affected by it. And the thing which I I've got to say I found the most shocking was to see it was still there. The whole of the plant was all still there, and a new plant had just been built next door. And I just can't tell you how moving it was. And I've got this image showing photographs of people who died there and also of animals who died there. But what we were actually there to see was really nothing to do with our Lutyens trip, and it was this building by Charles Correa. It's the Centre of Visual and Performing Arts, and when you think it was built only 2 years before the Bhopal disaster, and they had this wonderful vision of the future, and then the Union Carbide thing happened, and it's just totally dreadful. But possibly the most interesting of the sites we went to was at Sanchi. This is really why we were going to Bhopal. It's about 30 kilometers away from Bhopal. And I haven't found any reference to Lutyens visiting the site because I read up quite widely on him before I gave a talk previously. But Roddy was absolutely certain that he did. But it does seem to be one of the sites that most influenced the design of the dome of the Viceroy's house. And not only the stupas themselves, but there's a carving on one of the gateways, which gives almost the exact outline of the later Viceroy's house dome, but also the fence. The fence that surrounds the Great Stupa is something which Lutyens used in many of his, several of his buildings. It appears around the dome of the Viceroy's house, but also he used it on the ducal family graves and at the Phillipson Mausoleum in the Garden of Rest at Golders Green Crematorium. You'd also see the elephants in Lutyens' later work. But as a site, it is remarkable. I don't believe there's any record of Lord Buddha ever going there either. But the great king Ashoka had all this built, and it's if anybody was going to India, it's a bit off the tourist path, but it's just a wonderful thing to see. Do we now have the Jain temple of mirrors?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, this not a particularly dramatic building on the outside, but the inside is totally mirrored with mosaics of mirrors. And when we were there were two stark naked sadhus wandering around, and I leave you with the thought of seeing the reflections of thousands of willies in all these little mirrors. It was quite amazing. We next went to the ruined city of Mandu. Again, some magnificent buildings there. And Lord Hardinge particularly wanted Lutyens to go to see these before he prepared his drawings for the Viceroy's house. and I think you will see that he did take some references from them. So on that trip, we finished up in Mumbai, as we did on our trip last year, and I think everyone knows that Lutyens absolutely hated the Indo-Saracenic style of Bombay, and he. So I've just put together just a few slides of things that we saw. The Crawford Market is particularly interesting in that the carvings above the doorways were by Rudyard Kipling's father. You see the law courts, amazing sight of seeing all of the barristers and their clients all sitting on benches outside. And again, more of the Indo-Saracenic buildings of Mumbai. This is where Mumbai has its washing done, and we stayed at the Taj Hotel, but not the old bit. We stayed in the horrible tower, and Lutyens managed to hate both the Taj and the India Gate, so he just wasn't very keen on what had come before him. So now, talking about Lutyens, I won't say much about him because obviously people in society know a great deal about him anyway. But I would say that, like many of the people that I give talks about, I'm thinking Frank Lloyd Wright, Gaudi, Hunter Dwasa, Eric Gill, he was largely self-taught. He only did 2 years at South Kensington School of Art. But unlike the other self-taught people I mentioned, he was a jolly and affable chap, and everybody seemed to like him. There were 2 great women in his life: Emily Bulwer-Lytton, who he married, and Gertrude Jekyll, who he collaborated with on all his early work. And I found it quite interesting reading Mary Lutyens' tales about her father, and thinking about it very similar to reading Evelyn Waugh's diaries. The interest he took in his children was such that one day he asked her where she went to school, and the school where she'd been there for the previous 3 years, and he hadn't known. And it just shows a different age. Anyway, it was his work in Hampstead Garden Suburb which probably got him the commission for New Delhi. He hadn't solicited the New Delhi appointment, but the India office were looking for somebody to assist in advising on the location of the new capital city and its planning. And his work in Hampstead Garden Suburb had impressed, and he was asked to join Brodie, the borough engineer of Liverpool, and Captain George Swinton, the chairman of London County Council, on the Delhi Planning Committee. They were called the Delhi Experts. And he he asked if he could design the principal building, and that was agreed to. And he wrote to Herbert Baker saying, "I believe that I'm fixed up in Delhi. Oh, what fun if we could come together on it." But with regard to the request that he built in the Indian style, he famously said, "They want me to do Hindu, Hin don't, I say." So this is a picture of the Delhi experts on their elephant, and the plan shows the site that they ultimately chose. The Viceroy, I believe, had wanted it to be on the site of the Delhi Durbar, but they convinced him that it would be better where on the southern side of the Rasina Hill, and that was agreed. The scale of the thing, the drawing by Lutyens, the dimensions are in fractions of a mile. The an early drawing by Lutyens, and perhaps the most famous thing was the spat between Lutyens and Baker over what became known as Lutyens Bakerloo, to do with the incline of the ramp between the Secretariat buildings. Lutyens agreed to the drawings, but hadn't realised that it would cut off the bottom of the Viceroy's house. In fact, the Viceroy's house is set so far back that I don't think he would have ever have quite got the view that Lutyens was hoping for and expecting. The two great Secretariat buildings by Baker are not constructed to the same standard as the Viceroy's house by any manner of means. In fact, some of the workmanship on them is extraordinarily rough. But I think they are in their way quite fine. But the thing which particularly struck with me was the inscription around the doorway of the right-hand building, which says, "Liberty will not descend to a people must raise themselves to liberty. It is a blessing that must be earned before it can be enjoyed." And as we saw when we were there this year, that is still there. And there's the equivalent inscription the other side of the road in Hindi or Sanskrit, I don't know which, just so that they knew what he was saying. This is the circular Parliament building by Baker. We had a wonderful session there. Fortunately, one of the 6 languages that they use is English, but it made our Parliament look like a bit of a tea party in comparison. It was really raucous and absolutely splendid. While he was he made many visits to India and wrote back home quite often. I just included a couple of his letters. This one is actually to Baker's son, and he's got a little sketch of himself and Baker and the animals of India, which rather interestingly included a lion, which I think had been extinct there for some while. But in one of his letters home to Emily, he decided to get at Baker rather by saying that he believed that no designer should ever read poetry. There should be in the hearts of all men a natural desire for poetry. If read, easily acquired and satisfied. If not read, you have to get your eventual quota of it through and in your work. and not be doped by other people's adjectives. I think rather unkind comment on some of Baker's buildings. You get the view of the front of the Viceroy's house, which we could almost see last year through the fog and being socially distanced away from it. It's a massive building. It's built over 4 floors. It has 340 rooms. It's 200,000 square feet, which is fractionally larger than the Palace of Versailles, although it does, in truth, it doesn't look as large as the Palace of Versailles. It's 630 feet wide and 540 feet deep. At the peak of the work, there were 3,000 stonecutters working there, 20,000 other labourers, and about 100,000 cubic metres of stone were used. The budget was £400,000, but the outturn cost was £877, 136, and over 1.1 million, including the gardens and the staff quarters. I've put together some of his early drawings, a classical one, and one very much like it ultimately turned out. This is a plan showing the centre of New Delhi, and bearing in mind that the transport was, when designed, because obviously it wasn't built at the time of its design, didn't include really very many motor cars. The locals had to walk or have their bullock carts. The scale of it is absolutely massive, and the he particularly wanted the secretariat buildings to be where they were, because he felt that gave something of the Palace of Versailles about it. We went into the staff areas when we went last year, which again are built on incredibly grand scale, and they include the military barracks, a hospital, private offices. The plan is like a giant letter H, but with the main building in the centre. And we came in through the South Court, which is the tradesman's entrance. There's a shop during construction. And then this section through the building, showing the double height of the dome, rather similar to as it is in the Taj, and then a detail of that. The dome externally has the same fencing detail as at Sanchi, and I've just put together a few photographs of the outside. He did a detail under the eaves, which was based on the leaf shape of the Bodhi tree. And he also used this stone bell symbol. And it was said that the bells wouldn't ring until the British left India, but I don't think they did ring. Then some interior shots. The interior is massive and opulent. This is the Ashoka Hall, used for originally a ballroom. It's got a mural in the ceiling, which was presented by the Persian ruler at the time, and the carpet was woven in Kashmir. Formal meeting room where great state meetings are held, and then another meeting room, which actually is the one where the president met us for the high tea. Then under the Great Dome, you have another massive meeting room with interesting niches and columns. This is an early photograph of the building. This shows the scale of the site. And this is the Jaipur column, which he side shot through the gateway. And this next one shows the rather whimsical elephants that you put on the fence pillars. This is the back of the house and the gardens. The gardens are absolutely magnificent. I've put together a little drawing of the fountains, and the small photograph shows him with Shoesmith, who stayed on in India, and Musto, who was the director of horticulture. Near at the end, this is a rather whimsical statue of Lutyens. Lutyens obviously went on to have a great career after India. I've just chosen his two war memorials. I feel they have something of India about them. And I finally reached the end with Carl Laubin's picture, which shows in the centre his great masterpiece, which was unbuilt, Liverpool Cathedral, but also shows the Viceroy's house, which I think was his lifetime's masterpiece. So that was our trip.
Right. Thank you very, very much. I'm incredibly envious of you getting in to see all the Lutyens' work. I mean, our more recent trip focused mainly on post-war architecture, but the Lutyens stuff is absolutely amazing. Quite a lot of that central vista in Delhi is currently threatened, isn't it, Brent? I don't know how aware you are of that scheme.
Well,
there are proposals to build new additions along that main axis, and also to make some of the secretariat buildings into museums, which, you know.
Right. Well, when we were there, obviously Delhi is very, obviously the seven cities of Delhi, but they're all merged into one, and it is terribly overcrowded, and right now, sadly, one of the most polluted places, as we found. But in the centre, you've got this open space, and particularly you've got the bungalow zone, which I didn't mention. I think Lutyens only designed, 4 or 5 of the bungalows, but other people designed the rest. Well, when we were there, they were under threat. This is 22 years ago, they're under threat. And one of the things that Roddy was asked to do was to give a lecture at the School of Architecture. And it was one of the most amazing evenings of my life, I've got to say, because the audience was half young students and the other half politicians, who all seemed to be, dare I say, even fatter than me and very short and very bulgy. And they kept saying, "I have the floor." And they would raise their hand, stand up, they'd raise their hand, and they would start talking. And then another one would try to take over the floor. And it was just, I've never known anything quite like it. There's Roddy trying to talk about the importance of this lung in the centre of New Delhi. But I think it will always be under, I think it'll always be under threat, just because there is, you know, we saw what was happening there, and it's very difficult to have people living in bungalows which each have an acre of ground and this great space. So I don't know, but I hope they do keep it. The fact that it is now the president's residence and obviously the parliament is there might help it a bit, but I just don't know. But I could see an enormous change. Well, I've been to Delhi 4 or 5 times in between as well, but in the 22 years between the visit I'm talking about now and ours last year, the difference is just prodigious, and the pressure must be enormous.
Great. And we had a few questions, some of which I've answered on the Q&A button. But one thing, I mean, I can't, I mean, one of the questions was about, you know, how come Lutyens was so kind of derogatory about Indian architecture, and how come we basically didn't get thrown out? And I mean, most of those quotes that you were using were from his private letters back to his wife, but I don't think he was particularly tactful about what he was saying when he was there either, was he?
Well, not to start with. I managed to collect together quite a library on him. Obviously, you probably realise we have several of his buildings in North Hertfordshire, and so he is somebody of local interest. I think that, and actually, I also say what Roddy thought as well, because it is, I think, more or less the same. Roddy was appalled by some of the things that Lutyens has said, and he made that quite clear. But I think, and he wouldn't have looked at it wasn't his idea to go and look at the existing architecture. He was made to do it. But
that was the Viceroy who told him to go off and arranged his tour, was it?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, even before the Viceroy, it was part of his brief, and the English government and the Foreign Office were insistent that it be something of India, because I think he had in mind before he started. I've seen something from him where he actually said this. It was, he almost planned like a massive English country house at one stage. That was before the rather classical thing that Sketchy did. But I think he was taken by certain aspects of Indian architecture, and I would say that he was influenced, and the building he produced in the Viceroy's house, I think, is just, I think it's a sublime piece of architecture. It figures in my top 20 favourite buildings of all time, and it has a perfection about it. And the way that he incorporated the domes, the chhatris, the protecting shelves, he had wanted to do the whole building in white marble, but again, he was told in no uncertain terms that that was rather the stone of mausoleums, and so he couldn't.
Yeah.
But you'll see that he did actually use some light coloured stone. I think what he produced was just wonderful, and the planning again, which was more down to him than anybody else, again is absolutely true. The vistas that you look through, the arch and the chapter, and you and the way you got to Connaught Circus, and the whole planning of it, I think for its time, because you've got to remember it was planned about 10 years or more before it was built, more than that, and they didn't change, which is interesting. So I think he did a jolly good job. Yes. And the reason I included the two war memorials were as examples of his later work, were I think they showed that he'd been influenced by things he saw there. I don't know if that's common.
Well, there's one question here actually from Natalie, who says, did Lutyens ever admit his debt to the Indian architecture that he so hated? I mean, I think we would all agree that he really did draw incredibly creatively on what he saw, but did he ever say thank you very much?
I must admit, I didn't find that. One thing I did find was what an amazing workaholic he was. He would draw himself, and he would draw for 12 hours at a time, just passing on drawings to people. And he was completely different from Baker, I think, and that's why I think it's one of the reasons they fell out. But he was a strange fellow, and I'm quite a fan of Evelyn Waugh, and there's one part of Evelyn Waugh's diary where he's talking about him. Obviously, Lutyens is rather older than Waugh, and Waugh described him as being gaga. But I don't know. He had a strange life because he had this great love for his wife that wasn't reciprocated. And I can't remember how many trips he made to India. I think it was 14. Making 14 trips now with aeroplanes. Well, you can't do it now, but last year you could. But he had to go by sea. He sometimes went across land, stayed on the Côte d'Azur, and then took a boat through the Suez Canal and so on. But it was a hell of a trip, and and I think he put an enormous amount into it, and I think he did ultimately. There are various references to him loving the Indians. Actually, that quote I did about Benares does include how much he loved the Hindus, but didn't think anything of their sacred city. But no, I think, I'm sure we all have our feelings towards India. I've managed to go there quite a lot of times, and I absolutely love it. My wife loves Rajasthan and Kerala and even Delhi, but I can't say that she thought much of Calcutta. I don't believe Lutyens went to Calcutta. It says in his book that he didn't, but I don't know. But I think it's got a life, a vibrancy that I just absolutely adore. I think I could live there.
Well, I very much enjoyed going back last November, having not been since before I had my daughter, and I'm very much hoping that circumstances will allow that we'll be able to go again before too long. We're running way over, but just before we wrap up, Brent, we have had one question about whether did Roddy wear his kilt in India, And I think maybe you should answer that one and also explain a bit about Roddy's pigtail and his kilt before we finally pack up.
I am certain that he did, because the only time that I ever recall seeing Roddy not in his kilt was in Moscow. I think every other trip that we did, he wore his kilt, and I'm reminded of when we were in Hamburg, and I noticed that there was black lace hanging down below his kilt, and I got somebody to point it out to him, and he then gave us that even a little lecture about the problems with Marks and Spencer's, that he had to have a petticoat of silk, but he could only get them now with black lace trimming. It wasn't his choice. I thought, well, that was quite amusing. And of course, he's absolutely covered in tattoos. One arm was from his wrist to his shoulder was Morris wallpaper. An interesting man. And
yeah, an extraordinary character. I met him when I worked at the Victorian Society when I just graduated, and I found him initially terrifying and quite extraordinary, but in fact he was incredibly kind and generous to me and taught me a lot about Victorian architecture, so I became very fond of him. I think we probably should wrap up.
I was very fond of him.
We can't go out and drink now, Brent, but we're in different parts of town. And I just want to say thank you very, very much indeed for that. And also thank you to everyone who came along, and a big thank you to all the members of the Lutyens Society, some of whom I think have joined us, and really to give great credit to them for the fantastic work they do campaigning. We feel we're a niche organisation, they are much more niche. They campaign purely for Lutyens' own buildings, and it was for them that Roderick organised this trip that we've been talking about. So I think without more ado, we should say good night and hope to see you again next week when we're going to return to Japan. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.